What are the deepest rabbit holes you ever researched? Story 1. The family that couldn't sleep. I believe even the Vatican is involved in housing them and trying to come up with a cure. For 200 years, a noble Venetian family has suffered from an inherited disease that strikes their members in middle age, stealing their sleep, eating holes in their brains, and ending their lives in a matter of months. In Papua New Guinea, a primitive tribe is nearly obliterated by a sickness whose chief symptom is uncontrollable laughter. Story 2. Wikipedia's page on uncontacted tribes. It's fascinating to read about first encounters, how everyone reacts, the ultimate outcome. Every linked page about specific tribes is like its own mini drama. Like one of favorites is the Sentinelese. It's a tribe that lives on the North Sentinel Island, a largely unexplored island that is the territory of India. They can be considered a pinnacle of a tribe untouched by modern civilization. Their language is largely undocumented, let alone deciphered. Their language also does not have similarities with any other obscure language of any island or mainland Indian tribe, let alone any other world language. All purpose exploration expeditions, attempted contact, or even just a casual trip there, fishermen, have ended in a disaster one way or another because they adamantly reject all forms of contact. There was a history of open attacks, and even times when they killed a couple of local fishermen. They tend to attack any foreigner that travels too close to the village, but they mostly hide in the forest. Even their exact population estimate is vague, ranging from 15 to 500. They do not know how to make fire. Story 3. If you are into superheroes, worm. If you're not into superheroes because of how much of their world is hand-waved, definitely worm. It deconstructs every trope in the book, calls attention to why they wouldn't actually work the way they do in comics, and then usually finds a way to make them work anyways. There's a ton of creative use of powers, too. Fights pretty much never come down to who can punch harder or shoot bigger lasers. It's dark, though. As it turns out, putting power in the hands of the most traumatized does not lead to an improvement for society. Story 4. The Dyatlov Pass mystery was my rabbit hole for several months. So strange. What could make 9 college students madly rush out of their camping tent, down a mountain, in the middle of the night, in negative temps, undressed and in their socks? They all froze to death and were found with strange, serious injuries. This site has all the info, autopsy reports, photos from the students' cameras, etc. Warning, this is a deep rabbit hole and only seems simple. No one has been able to solve the mystery for 60 years. This was one of my favorite rabbit holes as well. A great mystery. Ultimately, I'm sure it's easily explained. I'm just not sure what the explanation is. A lot of the reading I did was people presenting a reasonable explanation and then saying, but if that's what happened, there would have been evidence A, B, and C. As somebody who has made a career out of investigating, 99.9% of info and explanations for why something couldn't have happened is just a bad conclusion. Lack of evidence is never evidence in and of itself. Story 5. I started reading about feral children a while ago. I think the earliest documented case I can remember was a boy named Victor, around the age of 7 or so, who was found somewhere in France in the mid to late 1700s by a hunting party. They brought him back into town, but he escaped. He was found again a year or two later and finally placed under the care of some psychologist who wanted to study him. Victor possessed some unusual physical features because of his feral upbringing, like hard calluses on his knees, among other things. He died around the age of 40 and only ever learned to say his name and the word milk in French. There are countless other documented stories of feral children from that point on all around the world, with most having similar characteristics of distorted physical features, adaptation to a meat or harsh diet, and an inability to learn human speech. Most of the children never lived to see adulthood, and it's one of the most fashionable internet rabbit holes I've ever explored. Story 6. Wiki travel is a super favorite of mine. I haven't been able to afford a vacation in years, so at least I have a website that has no affiliation to other travel review websites that I can browse through and dream about. Also, I love that their articles are written from very personal perspectives, so they seem to be a little more human. I actually will read a wiki travel article about an area of the world that comes up in the news that I might not know much about, just to get a sense of what the people are like. Not to mention, they had a run of great April Fool's entries you can still find on the website. Their entry on hell is a particular favorite of mine. Story 7. The Wiki Index for Unsolved Problems across various fields of study. The problems range from in-depth and complex to the kinds of questions a curious child would ask their parents. A few examples. Linguistics. Origin of language and origin of speech are major unsolved problems, despite centuries of interest in these topics. Neuroscience. Sleep. What is the biological function of sleep? Why do we dream? What are the underlying brain mechanisms? What is its relation to anesthesia? Learning and memory. Where do our memories get stored, and how are they retrieved again? How can learning be improved? What is the difference between explicit and implicit memory? What molecule is responsible for synaptic tagging? Astronomy. Fast radio bursts. Transient radio pulses lasting only a few milliseconds, from emission regions thought to be no larger than a few hundred kilometers, and estimated to occur several hundred times a day. While several theories have been proposed, there is no generally accepted explanation for them. The only known repeating FRB emanates from a galaxy roughly 3 billion light years from Earth. Origin and future of the universe. How did the conditions for anything to exist arise? Is the universe heading towards a big freeze, a big rip, a big crunch, or a big bounce? Or is it part of an infinitely recurring cyclic model? Story 8. The Bulwer-Lytton contest. The rules of the contest is basically just send the worst opening paragraph you can possibly write. And boy, did I spend hours through every year's nomination. One of my favorites, from 2018. I knew that Dame was trouble as soon as I set eyes on her. See, there was a stain on her clingy dress, wine, difficult to get out. You notice these things when you've been in the business as long as I have. There was a piece of gum stuck to the bottom of her high heel. Cherry, that would leave a gristly pink trail following her every step. You pick up on these things when you are as experienced as I. And when she coolly asked me directions to the detective's office, I pointed her down the hall and went back to mopping the floor. Story 9. 6 degrees of separation. 6 degrees of separation is the idea that all people are 6 or fewer social connections away from each other. As a result, a chain of a friend statements can be made to connect any two people in a maximum of 6 steps. It was originally set out by Frigyes Karinthy in 1929 and popularized in an eponymous 1990 play written by John Guare. It is sometimes generalized to the average social distance being logarithmic in the size of the population. Story 10. Prison cuisine. I don't mean the food served in the dining hall, but instead the food the prisoners manage to prepare outside of the official meal times. It is amazing what people come up with when there are limited tools available. I don't think any population, and that includes college students, have explored the permutations of how top ramen can be prepared in a microwave as extensively as prisoners. The finer points of making a toilet hook. There is a cult surrounding proprietary prison commissary items. Obviously, the food often looks like garbage, but the innovation passed on food knowledge, cooperative effort, and pride that they exhibit in their craft really humanizes the prisoners to me. I came away uplifted after watching many videos on the subject. Story 11. Watch the Paranormal Scholar. Any number of rabbit holes. Also, all-time conspiracies. Among them, some personal favorites are the Denver Airport, the Orang Medan, the Black Knight Satellite. Go there for the summary and then start digging. Some other favorites. Black-eyed children, Reddit posts about the paranormal, and stuff about the dark web. Most of the latter is not entirely accurate, though. If you like fictional rabbit holes and a touch of horror, check out the SCP Wiki. Lots of cool stuff from that community, and a lot of it goes deep. Story 12. The SCP Wiki. It's a fun collaborative project between thousands of writers that sort of erupted out of the depths of the internet. It's sort of about this secret paramilitary organization that covers up and contains the supernatural. It's really interesting because most of the entries are written as scientific documents Charge classified military documents on all these supernatural things, with redactions and black ink. Except the lore is a total rabbit hole that gets deeper and crazier as you go with just the right amount of mystery to make your imagination run wild. If you're a fan of Lovecraft, I cannot recommend SCP enough. Story 13. If you like adventure travel, even vicariously, this 65-page travelogue of a couple who drove across the Democratic Republic of Congo several years ago is riveting. It brings up ethical questions, which the couple addresses, about the role of white travelers in Africa and how to compensate people who help them. The stories of long-term missionaries in the village's outposts are fascinating. One note that impressed me: while planning their route and knowing that many of the roads on the map were going to be impassable, they contacted Coca-Cola to ask about their distribution network in the country. Coke didn't distribute their products outside of major cities, which was a red flag about the viability of the non-major roads in DRC. Didn't stop them, though. Story 14. If you are interested in prison, crime, charge justice at all, I would recommend checking out the ADX Florence Supermax Prison Wikipedia and just researching anything interesting you run across. It is the US government's only super maximum security prison. There are maximum security state prisons, but this is the only federal one, which hosts a slew of famous criminals. Despite its scenic location, the inmates cannot see over the wall from any location in the prison. In fact, the prison is designed so that the inmates have no idea where they are within the facility at any given time, and their only view of the outside is occasionally of the sky. Story 15. Trying to reconcile obeying the road laws, using a bicycle and actual road safety, and respect for a cyclist. There's a lot of contradictory advices and rhetorics. Example, get off the road versus use the road, not sidewalk. It's the law, or speeding versus impeding, or just go around and stay in the bike lane. A whole lot of double standards. If speed and demeanor is exactly the same, I would get a stink eye on the bike, but a blind eye in the car. And a lot of damned if I do, damned if I don't, like being told off for ignoring right of way, understandable. But also being told, cemetery is full of people with right of way when I assert. And I will not stop talking and ranting about it until it is resolved. Lives are at stake. Story 16. D. Since I like building websites, I decided to make a blog out of it. It got pretty good traction, and I was even invited to be a guest on a popular podcast. Unfortunately, I've since gotten too busy with other things, and developments in the UFO or UAP world have been developing too rapidly for me to keep up with, so the site sits dormant. Story 17. Recently, I climbed the tallest mountain in South Korea and became curious about the tallest mountains in other countries. Then, I became curious if anyone has ever climbed the tallest mountain in every country on Earth. The answer is no, but there is one French guy attempting it. But he says he doesn't expect to pull it off before he dies, and the task is generally considered impossible, but not for the reasons you'd think. There are two countries that present a pretty much insurmountable barrier to the challenge. One is Bhutan, because they consider mountain peaks to be sacred and forbid anyone to climb them. And they're in the Himalayas, so it's not like you can just stroll up any of their mountains without anyone noticing. The other one, hilariously, is Vatican City, because no one's ever bothered to figure out where the highest geological point in the country is. Story 18. Saw an episode of Mad Men one time. They are eating at a picnic. Finish. Wife just picks up a blanket, shaking it out, letting all the trash just blow away wherever. Don Draper finishes his drink and just chunks it. Lead me down the rabbit hole wondering why they showed that. Learned how prior to those years, nothing really was trash prone. You bought it and kept it. Suddenly companies were making one-time use products, and there were no trash bins in society to properly rid of the products. So littering became very problematic. Anti-littering campaigns started popping up, placing blame on consumers rather than companies now making cheap one-time use products. Regardless, it took a whole generation or more to change the norm and habits of people to start being responsible and throwing away all this one-time use stuff now. It also explained the visible gap in habits I'd seen when I was a teen and working odd jobs cleaning up. Older silent era, older baby boomer aged people, were the ones who did not pick up after themselves, leaving such a mess in parks and the theater I worked in. Younger customers would clear everything and toss everything away as they left. Younger generations were engrossed with anti-littering campaigns growing up. Older generations weren't, and older habits are hard to break. Whole childhoods of just tossing trash wherever and trying to break such habits seems as difficult as what some smokers go through trying to quit. As the older generations have died off, I see the difference. Stadiums aren't as trashed out after the games as they used to be. A lot more patrons pick up after themselves. All this realization and connection from after seeing one short scene in a park of an episode of Mad Men. Story 19. I'm down one pretty deep right now. I went to a for-profit art school in California 20 years ago. I've been a huge researcher and advocate for canceling student loan debt traps for folks who ended up at a for-profit diploma mill. I've only recently discovered that Richard Bloom, Senator Dianne Feinstein's husband, was a majority shareholder of both IIT and CEC, two of the largest for-profit school companies, and she was also a huge investor. Bloom was also a regent for the entire UC system and controlled the portfolio of the UC system, as well as the public pension for California's public workers. He used the UC endowment and retirement portfolios to invest in these scam schools, while at the same time raising tuition costs at all UC schools to push poor people into the for-profit schools. Feinstein was also a huge investor and voted accordingly. The two of them made billions, which the student borrowers are stuck in a lifetime of crushing debt for worthless degrees. She is the fourth wealthiest senator that currently holds office. Story 20. There's a website dedicated to celebrity heights, and it has a fairly active community of commenters who will bitterly argue over whether someone like Jason Momoa is 6'5" or 6'4", and 3 parts out of 4, and also say things like, he was definitely a solid 6'5" in his prime, but not anymore. Just sort of an example of how people on the internet will argue about literally anything. But I have nonetheless found myself clicking around on that site and reading comments and going, I didn't know so-and-so was that tall and short, etc. Story 21. Non-ARG rabbit hole. The caves in the U.S. full of surplus cheese as a result of the federal government keeping the dairy industry artificially propped up since the Great Depression. Also, the reason we had the Got Milk campaign and put so much cheese in absolutely everything. Spent an unreasonable amount of time researching this subject after reading the words cheese caves online one day. ARG rabbit hole. Alan Resnick's This House Has People in It started as one of those weird little surrealist horror clips that played once in the dead of night on Adult Swim and led to a massive archive of additional footage, building the context of the clip and the backstories of all the family members involved. A girl melts through the floor. A dad secretly dresses up as Sonic the Hedgehog. A yard eats a children's birthday party. Nightmind has a several hours long video summarizing and analyzing it all if you don't have the even more hours it takes to pour over all the footage yourself, like my roommate and I did. Story 1. The Great Glitter Mystery. There is a company in NJ that is the top glitter manufacturer in the world. When being interviewed, they were asked who their biggest client was. They refused to answer, saying they don't want people to know. Cue millions of people speculating on who the biggest glitter client in the world is and why they want to keep it secret. Story 2. I went down the rabbit hole about the Silk Road Marketplace, the illegal black market site on the deep web. I always found it fascinating that one singular dude was able to attribute so much to drug trafficking simply from his laptop. The whole story is so intriguing to me. It's actually one of the reasons I went into my current field, which is cybersecurity. The internet is such a vast and enormous place. The amount of crime that occurs simply from people's computers has always mind-boggled me. Story 3. The American Chestnut Blight. What was once the redwood of the East Coast was practically wiped out in the early 20th century due to imports of trees from Asia that contained the blight fungus but were resistant. Today we have the technology to bring back the American chestnut, using minor gene modification, I believe, from wheat, but I don't believe federal approval has yet been granted to reintroduce. To me, this is a fascinating bit of science, where we have the power to bring back an almost forgotten yet iconic species. I find this an incredibly interesting topic and went down quite the rabbit hole. Story 4. Sovereign Citizens. Between the police body cam footage of traffic stops to their in-court appearances, where they try to represent themselves, my sick fascination. A part of it is quite sad because these people have made awful decisions in life. But on the other hand, they're choosing to live within delusion, and the consequences are satisfying. I shot an interview with a police officer a while back who talked about the FMOTL types. He said that they tried as hard as possible to point these people into just not doing that, but they would always decide on the worst possible course of action. Like having everyone stand around in the pissing rain while they argue that they weren't driving. They were traveling, and therefore they cannot be done for doing 50 and a 20 limit kind of thing. Story 5. The Trials game Easter Egg and Treasure Hunt. There is a series of video games that people are probably at least vaguely familiar with called Trials. It's a game in which you ride a bicycle or motorcycle from point A to point B and ride over obstacles, do flips, etc. I've never actually played it, so apologies if it's not a great description. In a nutshell, players found some items and locations in the game that seemed to be related. Someone figured out that it appeared to be a puzzle that spanned multiple versions of the game. The puzzle was wildly complicated, including things like secret websites, real-life locations across the globe, analyzing sound waves from songs, etc. The last step that was established was that someone needed to be in a specific location to receive a package in the year 2100 or something. The guy I was following who kept up on this stopped posting, and completely by chance, I saw him post here in r/askreddit. I messaged him asking what came of the puzzle, and he said life had gotten busy and he hadn't been able to keep up. But last he heard, people had been coordinating to have their kids and grandkids at the location at the specific time. It's one of the crazier things I've heard of, and probably won't hear of its resolution in my lifetime. But the rabbit hole is a fun read of seeing how things were uncovered and how in depth the puzzle is. Story 6, I have two. One is deeply researching uncontacted people and murders of people trying to contact them. You can find maps and islands, and it's just wild. Another was Peacher, okay? Drove through there on Route 66 while driving to Texas and noticed huge piles of what looked like salt and an absolute ghost town in the middle of nowhere. Turns out it was declared as a natural disaster zone, and everyone was supposed to evacuate. Some people stayed, but the big holdout was a doctor who eventually died at a somewhat young age. Story 7. Back in the early 2000s, I stumbled upon a website where the only content was this one man's Walmart receipts. He'd go shopping, then scan and upload his receipts for people to see and comment on. He'd done this for a few years by the time I found his website. I spent like 3 days looking at Walmart receipts because, after a while, they kind of started to tell a story. The guy got married, had a kid, and I left off around the time the kid was potty trained. It was like a journal written in Walmart receipts. You could follow him through the seasons, whether he had a cold, birthday cards, and gifts for family, and see the growth of his child all through his Walmart purchases. It was fascinating. Story 8. Cicada 3301 spoilers. Pretty much a random group of unknown people were looking for geniuses to join their group of hackers or whatever. They made claims of being responsible for leaking some big things and being able to pull strings behind the scenes and so on. They made a ton of ciphers and puzzles spanning over years, and some were actually physically hidden IRL. They became increasingly more and more difficult. Some of them were insanely hard to crack. Even knowing the answer to some of them, it still blows my mind how people were able to figure it out. Some are still unsolved to this day. There is a 60-ish page book filled with hidden messages and clues, but no real answer to what or why it exists. Either way, only people that were able to solve all of them solo were selected to continue, and the puzzles stopped being made public. So there were unique tests and stuff for each individual that made it that far. This acted as a screening process because they literally only wanted the best of the best. So it came down to just a few people that ended up finishing the multi-year test. Turns out the entire thing was more or less a recruitment to a small group of people who would just chat and weren't actually doing anything. Some of the people that actually got in leaked the ciphers and puzzle solutions to get in after they had left. And even though it was a giant nothing burger, it's insane how hard some of them were to solve, and it blew my mind how smart people are to even create the cipher, let alone solve it. All for nothing, lol. Story 9. I work in dermatology. I've had a few people that would send us pictures of the threads and bugs and etc. they would dig out of their body. Had to explain more than once. You are tearing out adipose tissue and muscle. Please stop. One woman used a fish hook to dig at her face. There was no skin left on 75% of her face. Others used pliers or whatever random tools they had at their disposal. Another woman was covered head to toe with infected lesions that she would just not leave alone. No matter how many times we dressed her wounds and referred her to wound care, she would take them off as soon as she got home and resume picking. Eventually ended up in the ICU with sepsis, and I believe she passed, as we never heard from her again. Very sad to see because they get mad frustrated when you explain they need psychiatric help to manage it. We can heal the skin, but only if they curb the actual behaviors. Story 10. There's a whole set of YouTube shorts where former NBA stars talk about Larry Bird. I've probably watched hundreds of these shorts. I don't like basketball. Ooh, also, The Undertaker apparently has a podcast and makes YouTube shorts. I've watched a ton of his content too, but I've never been interested in professional wrestling. I guess I have a type. Larry Bird is such an interesting character. He's one of the greatest trash talkers in the history of the NBA, was the main player on one of the greatest dynasties in the league, had the greatest rivalry ever, and had one of the most unique reasons for retiring. He's also one of only a few people who has been successful at all three levels of the league, player, coach, and general manager. I can understand why people talking about him would be interesting. Story 11. One of my favorite books is Wizard of Earthsea